So, welcome to the first prolonged comic book case study video. Today, I wanted to talk about a character that I find immensely interesting. Throughout later reading and research, I just find myself endlessly pulled into him and honestly relating to him and relating to the creation of this character. Today I wanted to talk about Jack Kirby's favourite new god, Mr. Miracle. Bit of background, but most people are already acquainted with this, but Jack Kirby was pioneer of comics. He created some of the most iconic characters we know today, and he was very much the pillar of Marvel's catalogue of characters, creating or co-creating characters from Captain America to the Hulk to Iron Man, Black Panther, Fantastic Four, and many, many more. Jack was a legend in comics, still is. Often referred to as the king of comics, with a lot of biographies written about him. One I have on my desk here, which much of this video is based around or taking notes from or referencing. Tim Scioli's Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics. Jack is a beloved and celebrated writer today. But in his time, he had a lot of run-ins with editorial. From my reading of Tim Scioli's graphic novel biography of Jack Kirby, I get the impression that he was just spilling out with stories that reinforced his fast-paced work ethic. He was notoriously a workaholic and would often bring his work home with him. Work on stuff in his own time, and much of it was inspired by stuff around him. At the same time, Jack never really wanted to let go of the stories he was telling. He shed so much of a part of himself into them that they were his. But at the same time, he worked under Marvel. Anything he created in-house in their studio, it was a part of their catalogue. They owned all rights to the characters Jack would create under them. The company would manage the characters and creative teams, and if something was performing as they desired, that book would continue. If not, unfortunately, it get the chop. And within the hierarchy of the company, editors were hired to oversee books, make changes where they see fit, and often act as the medium between the editor-in-chief and the creative teams. One of Stan Lee's roles throughout the 1960s was as an editor, and he was an editor on many of Jack Kirby's books. And from what I could see, Jack wasn't a fan of having his work altered. He wanted to be the authority on his own work. One thing in this video that I don't want to do is write Stan Lee off like a villain. Stan is and forever will be a legend of comics. And in his time working at Marvel, he would often bounce between writer and editor, and during his times in those positions, he would butt heads, famously with Jack, but other writers as well. But since Stan was the editor, he held the authority and could course correct books where he saw fit. From looking back at Jack's mountains of work, you can really see he laid his passion into it. As I said earlier, Jack would insert himself into his work or find himself inspired by people around him. But much of it was him. Most famously with Marvel, often the Thing is seen as the insert for Jack, you know? Many other characters have parts of him too. By the late 60s, Jack had begun developing a new library of characters. Put plainly, he'd developed a pantheon, which needed a clean slate from which to launch. So Jack had approached Stan about performing Ragnarok in the Thor books, the death of the gods to make way for new gods. Stan was very reluctant. Thor was one of their best-selling books. By 1968, the numbers I could find for Thor put it at 371,000 issues sold per month. Ever the businessman, you could see Stan's reluctance. Jack had various issues with Marvel, and this seems to be the one that just pushed him over the edge. The straw that broke the camel's back. He had to get out. He had to escape. And so in reaction, Jack had approached DC's publisher, Carmine Infantino. Put simply, Carmine liked what he saw, and Jack Kirby was a name that held a lot of weight in comic books. So Jack ended up creating a whole new line of comics for DC, the Fourth World. Starting in Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, we got early appearances of the villain of the saga, Darkseid. Later, the Fourth World would be expanded into the New Gods, the Forever People, and finally, the topic of discussion, Mr. Miracle. These books were a large-scale space opera, probably the biggest thing Jack had ever attempted in his career. A large, interweaving saga of 3 to 4 books that were being published, all under his control, under his approval. Jack had the most authority he had ever had in a book before. For a time, anyway. Mr. Miracle, out of all of Jack's characters, particularly of his Fourth World, was his baby. Mr. Miracle, also known under the alias Scott Free, was partially inspired by another comic book legend, Jim Steranko, who before his time working in comics spent much of his young career as a magician and escape artist. Escape artistry, matched with that feeling that had been brewing in Jack for a while, was the fuel for this character. And so we got Mr. Miracle, the child of warring space gods, who had come to a truce and traded their sons as a term of this peace. And scot-free Mr. Miracle ended up living his life into his adulthood under the torment of his father's adversaries. Eventually, Scott would break free of his programming and escape, unintentionally reigniting the war between Apocalypse and New Genesis. All the while he was just trying to live a life free of the reigns of the Fourth World, of the New Gods. What defined Mr. Miracle was his escapism. He was juxtaposed against the rest of the New Gods. He wasn't defined by the fight, but in his escape from the fight. He'd have been a victim of Darkseid and the War of the New Gods for so long that he just wanted to be away from it and live. He began a life on Earth. He made a friend, fell in love, gained an apprentice, and had a career. And each issue of Jack Kirby's run would be an attempt by the agents of Darkseid to disrupt this and to pull scot-free back into the fray. But outside the story, in the meta-narrative sense, Jack is, or at least was, Mr. Miracle. I know earlier I had mentioned that Jack inserts himself into his work, but this felt like more him than he'd ever given before. Like Jack, Mr. Miracle wanted to escape and live free out of the hands of control. And it feels so thematically appropriate that in his dissatisfaction with Marvel, he created a character that resembled the journey he then undertook. I think for creative people, that's the most relatable thing. We all want to share our full, true, unfiltered expression and art because it feels the most us, but sometimes your most cherished idea isn't always your best. But it can be your most meaningful. Look, in my opinion, I don't think Jack would have ever have created Mr. Miracle for Marvel. I know in Tim Scully's biography of Jack Kirby, there's very much an implication of it there, but to me, I don't think he ever would have. Maybe I'm just trying to extract more meaning from it than there actually is, but I believe he would have given Marvel the New Gods, but Mr. Miracle was a character birthed out of a desire to get away. And I couldn't see him making that character for them. I couldn't see him making Mr. Miracle without escaping first. I know years later, after parting with DC, he would return to Marvel and create a spiritual successor, or a spiritual sequel to the New Gods in the Eternals. But I've never found an analogue for the Mr. Miracle character when he returned to Marvel. And maybe that speaks to Jack's satisfaction when he returned. Or maybe it speaks to him being more jaded and giving up. But to me, reading his Mr. Miracle with that knowledge injects so much more humanity into the story. And knowing that there was genuine desire for unfiltered and full creativity, it just hits in a way. I mean, everything about the Fourth World was the most limitless Jack had ever been. Even in the designs, they're so loud. I mean, Mr. Miracle is crazy looking. And I love that. It's incredible. Though the sad thing is, just like Marvel, DC were a business. And Jack Kirby's Fourth World was cancelled. It simply wasn't performing as desired, and the books took too long to be published. And so Jack Kirby's Fourth World came to an end. They were generous enough to give him time to finish, but he'd still finished before he wanted to, before the story was finished. Mr. Miracle finished after 19 issues, along with the Forever People finishing after 11, as did the New Gods, though the New Gods later got closed off with a graphic novel called The Hunger Dogs, but it was still cut short. And though Jack never got to see his work through to completion, the Fourth World didn't stay dead. In 1977, the New Gods were revived by Jerry Conway, and later that same year, Mr. Miracle was brought back by Steve Englehart and Steve Gerber, continuing on the story from the very next issue. Though the creative teams would change, the character never did. They would always maintain the spirit that Kirby had brought to the original story, choosing to highlight or flesh out already existing components. With Englehart and Gruber, they decided to flesh out Scott's showmanship as an affront to his enemies, fully embracing the Mr. Miracle persona and almost fortifying it, using his showmanship as his weapon. And later in 1989, J.M. DeMatteiis, from what little of this run I have read, would highlight Scott's escape into the American dream, a full departure, an attempt at a full departure from the New Gods. And finally, the book that reignited my passion for comics and was kind of the source for this video, Tom King and Mitch Gerards' Mr. Miracle from 2019, a book about the cost of trauma and torment. A book dripping in appreciation for the medium. King creates a story where at first Scott folds under pressure and hardship, but due to things not larger than him, but for the people around him he cares about and loves, he rises and faces his oppressor, which Darkseid is, and chooses to live. Not in the shadow of it all, not in spite of it, but because he wants to. And I think that harkens back to Jack. Jack didn't want to create out of spite. He didn't want to create under the arms of others. He wanted to create because he wanted to. He was an artist at heart, much like the character he then birthed. And for those like myself, very much interested in the context and culture around these books, I can only encourage you. My reading was only enhanced by my research. The choices that King, Englehart, DeMattieis would make, they're given a certain gravity when you realize why those choices were made and what they are calling back to, or what they are referencing, or what they are reinforcing. And I think it's more than valuable. Jack's Fourth World was something truly special in comics. I genuinely believe it was Jack's magnum opus, his most bold and ambitious, and something in this video I haven't talked about in too much detail. I implore you to read Kirby's original stuff. And if that's too of its time for you, I'd recommend what people have done after. They have really carried the torch. Some of them, many of them have. The beauty is that those who came after didn't forget what it was about. They too, from their works, seem to have understood and appreciated what Jack had brought forth. Jack was incredible and second to none. Although he's passed, his legacy stands strong. Long live the King of Comics. So, I forgot to record an outro. Please like and subscribe. Comment down below. Let me know what you think, what you'd like to see in the future, and if this was any good. Thank you very much for watching.